It says record.
And does anyone feel volunteerish?
She does.
That's a look of both terror and anger. Yeah, you certainly may. So we will need a couple of volunteers at different points. My hope is that this will be like what I've been thinking about all week, which is a Gallagher concert, in that you will all have to hold garbage bags up over your faces and chests to avoid being splattered with the melon splishins of learning. Hey, you showed up. Cool. In celebration for showing up, you should have a cookie. And some coffee. Oh yeah, by all means. Hey, you're not actually meant to serve.
You gotta wait a second on that.
Apparently. I like to discover those things firsthand.
I'm glad I didn't catch that.
Yeah. Well, that's fine. It's not my coffee maker, so therefore responsibility is minimal. I'm more culpable, but yet less responsible somehow. It's good stuff.
You have to clean it.
You would think that. The answer is I should clean it. Yeah, you certainly may. Feng shui in the classroom, very important. The chalk must go in front of the bits of fish.
The bits of fish?
Yeah, I assume that's what they feed fish, is smaller fish. Lake-sized fish, in this case.
It's an interesting thing.
I don't think anybody knows any
different. They fed to a
different.
beta fish, so that means they have to eat gamma fish. That's right, a little bit of Greek jokes. Yeah, everyone loves alphabet humor. I would throw those, but there's the fair chance that folks would get gouged in the brains.
That might happen anyway.
That's true. But I want the camera to be on when that happens.
Is it on now?
Both for insurance purposes and for purposes of awesome. For those of you who aren't in my classes, this isn't how most of them actually begin. It's sad staring at the clock process to determine.
When it's time to start.
Yeah. It's kind of like one of those animatronic Chuck E. Cheese things. That's what I imagine they're doing, just waiting for that moment when a rat can play a banjo. Which, they have Chuck E. Cheese out here, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
Do they
it's
still?
not just Hojo's or...
Do they still
Is it?
have the theater with people like the big animatronic musicians? No.
They had a little door at the Chuck E. Cheese when we were kids. Yeah, the tiny one. That was
That's true. It kind of makes Chuck E. Cheese like being John Malkovich, the film.
Oh, that was
Where that would be I guess that would be a door into Chuck E. Cheese's brain.
Which would be Nolan Bush.
I think so. Yeah. Sadly, my Chuck E. Cheese lore is sketchier than it used to be.
There was an article about him in Forbes last year.
Seriously? Forbes, you gain my respect. More and more. watching the curtain before they get in, and it's really uncomfortable and you don't really enjoy it, that's what we're trying to do.
So thoughts?
Yeah.
Yeah, come on in. Grab one of those. And then one of those.
That's a cookie. You don't have to grab it.
Oh,
I would
fine.
recommend it.
I'm good, sir.
You can get out. That cookie was made with love.
Yeah,
I
you
did.
See, that's why I'm
That, I will accept that honest decision.
I imagine you would start reading the recipe and then try to like break it into prose or do like a Captain Kirk impersonation while you're reading the recipe.
Right. The, what
Or
would be?
well, actually, you would seem more like a count. Like,
Right.
and it would just go
Right.
downhill from there.
2 cups of sugar. Yeah, there's a lot of choking. And honestly, that's all I think I was waiting for. Getting an MFA in poetry, which therefore gives me the power to put on crazy events like this occasionally and guilt your teachers into asking you to come. Also, the man with the camera who is going to be speaking a bit as well is Mr. J.R. Walsh.
Hi, I'm Jared Walsh. I'm also a poetry MFA candidate, my 2nd year. Erik's in his 3rd year.
Right, right, which means if we have to do academic leg wrestling, I win.
Yeah.
The extra year training, basically. So, one of the principles of this, before we kind of get into things, is that we've gone through a fair amount of poetry stuff at this point, and some fiction stuff and some non-fiction stuff. And throughout that, we've never really gotten a formal instruction on how to read anything. So we've had to do that with a lot of trial and error.
Literacy.
What's that?
Literacy.
Yeah, literacy as well. Looking at pictures, trying to figure out what they mean. Word pictures, as it were. Myself, I came from a background of doing some slam poetry and failing pretty consistently. I like to think of myself as sort of the Susan Lucci of the slam scene in Minnesota. And to show the learning process, I did have a bottle thrown at me once while reading a poem. So I guess, if anything, this is sort of a talk on how not to get a bottle thrown at you while reading a poem. Or hopefully, I guess, while doing anything else, if you can avoid being bottles being thrown.
You know, not reading a poem at all is a good way to avoid it.
Yeah, that the poem tends to lead to the bottle. It's a very causal effect. Aristotle talked about that a bit. So, we were going to start out with something more than just me talking at you. So, I need 2 volunteers.
Pick me! Pick me!
Come on up. Your name is called if the price is right.
Do I need the?
Yes.
Do you have any objection to being filmed?
No.
Okay. Thanks.
So, we're going to try us a little bit of game here to start things out. We've all got this Susan Mitchell poem. My copy doesn't look like your copy, so it's not so useful for me to hold that up. But, yeah. First page here. What we're going to try doing is each of us are going to go down here in a line, and we're going to try and reactively read to one another. What that means is that Amber is going to read this poem, and then I'm going to try and read it in the opposite way, in the opposite style. Then you, sir, get to try and read it in the opposite style from me. And then Mr. Walsh, final opposite style. Yeah, opposite. That's whatever that might be. Would you feel more comfortable going one stage closer, or is it going to be terrifying whatsoever? All right. If you need to cry, there are people here to give a hug. We do promote hugs, not crying here, poetry. Yes?
Question. This will probably make sense when I see it or hear it, but you say the opposite instead of an opposite. And I mean, are you saying there are only two ways to read this poem, or are there several?
That's a good question. The hope is to prove that there are several, and to start thinking about how many ways there are, the different ways that, how reading this poem in different ways kind of makes it sound different or makes it understood differently. So.
Okay. The Dead by Susan Mitchell. At night, the dead come down to the river to drink. They unburden themselves of their fears, their worries for us. They take out the old photographs. They pat the lines in our hands and tell our futures, which are cracked and yellow. Some dead find their way to our houses. They go up to the attics. They read the letters they sent us, insatiable, for signs of their love. They tell each other stories. They make so much noise, they wake us.
Keep coming. Don't worry, people read. Yep. There are handouts. Excellent. So we will pause momentarily so I can re-explain the experiment. There are more folks coming, presumably, right? Are you with Chris?
Yeah.
Okay. Or Mr. Klingbeil? Professor Klingbeil? Does he make you call him Professor Klingbeil?
No.
Oh, you should. I bet he'd get uncomfortable. On the front of your packets, if you're in here new, if you've already heard this, just pretend you're hearing it for the first time and stay excited. You got a poem. We're playing a game right now where we're trying to read the poem in an opposite way as each one of us goes along. So Amber's going to read it one way. I'm going to try and read it in an opposite fashion. What's your name? Adam. Adam is going to try and read it in yet another fashion, so I don't have to just keep pointing at you. Now I can point and say a name. And then Mr. J.L. Walsh will cap things off. And then we can go crazy after that.
Okay, let's
So.
try this one more time. The Dead by Susan Mitchell. At night, the dead come down to the river to drink. They unburden themselves of their fears, their worries for us. They take out the old photographs. They pat the lines in our hands and tell our futures, which are cracked and yellow. Some dead find their way to our houses. They go up to the attics. They read the letters they sent us, insatiable, for signs of their love. They tell each other stories. They make so much noise, they wake us, as they did when we were children and they stayed up drinking all night in the kitchen.
So what made you choose that way to read?
Well, I paused at periods and at the end of lines, and I guess I wouldn't really do something so upbeat because it's about the dead.
About the dead. All right.
Myself, should
So.
I say.
Yeah, you can sit down if you don't like being stared at.
Amazingly enough, no.
Yeah, now it's just us staring at you as you sit. All right, let's give this a shot. The dead. At night, the dead come down from the river to drink, and they unburden themselves of their fears, their worries for us. They take out the old photographs. They pat the lines in our hands and tell our future, which are cracked and yellow. Some dead find their way to our houses. They go up to the attics. They read the letters they sent us, insatiable for signs of their love. They tell each other stories. They make so much noise they wake us, as they did when we were children, and they stayed up drinking all night in the kitchen. All right.
My turn.
Yeah.
The dead. At night, the dead come down to the river to drink. They unburden themselves of their fears, their worries for us. They take out the old photographs. They pat the lines on our hands and tell our futures, which are cracked and yellow. Some dead find their way to our houses. They go to the attics. They read the letters they sent to us, insatiable, for signs of their love. They tell each other stories. They make so much noise. They wake us, as they did when we were children and they stayed up, drinking all night in the kitchen.
So what were you reacting to there, Adam?
Seriously.
My seriousness? Sort of over seriousness almost?
Melodrama.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you. Mr. Walsh.
You gotta turn it
Yeah, you should do the like.
Or at least point it at the page.
We're going to talk about intentionality later. At night, the dead come down to the river to drink. They unburden themselves of their fears, their worries for us. They take out the old photographs. They pat the lines in our hands and tell our futures, which are cracked and yellow. Some dead find their way to our houses. They go up to the attics. They read the letters they sent us, insatiable for signs of their love. They tell each other stories. They make so much noise. They wake us, as they did when we were children, and they stayed up drinking all night in the kitchen.
I think I'm going to go one more time, back and forth. Did that work? All right. Hipster. At night, the dead come down to the river to drink. They unburden themselves of their fears, their worries for us. They take out the old photographs. They pat the lines in our hands and tell our futures, which are cracked and yellow. Some did find their way to our houses. They go up to the attics. They read the letters they sent us, insatiable for the signs of their love. They tell each other stories. They make so much noise. They wake us, as they did when we were children, and they stayed up, drinking all night in the kitchen. Hand gestures make everything more exciting.
Well, I'm curious, though, so do you think, I'm curious if everyone else wonders about this as well, that each individual performance is like a cover version of what's here on the page? Because it's very different. I mean, it's the same thing every time here.
Well, it's sort of a funny thing, because that, I guess, when I think of a cover version, there's like an original I'm reacting to. And it's not, I guess it's not quite like that in my mind, because that assumes that there's one original way to read this. There's more of kind of a translating going on, I think. It's kind of like reading the novel Dracula and then seeing any of the film versions. That inherently there's kind of a reimagination or redistribution which has to take place in order to make it work. And I think I can move directly into that to talking about some of this stuff a little bit. Because, I mean, we have this basic question of, like, why is it important to read a poem? And I guess sometimes I think about this thing that one of my old rhetoric professors used to talk about, where they would say that it's this kind of lawyer's quote where they say the evidence speaks for itself, which is a total lie. Because if you can sort of imagine, like, you're all in a jury box and at a murder trial, and a lawyer comes down and says, Foxfish flakes on the stand. There we go. Evidence. Exhibit A. Now, if I were to go sit down there for like 10 minutes, y'all would probably just stare at that, and it wouldn't reveal anything about it. And the problem is that us just staring at this means there's no way to emphasize key details or kind of explain context or any of the background surrounding the object or say why it's important in the first place or even what it has to do with the case. And this my rhetoric professor used to explain was that the reason why lawyers used to call expert witnesses to talk about a piece of evidence in order to kind of reveal the meaning behind the evidence. And that's the relationship I kind of want us to think about between written work and the reader, is that you're dealing with evidence and you're kind of the expert witness who knows how it works, but who has to express what exactly is going on. Because we were starting to talk a little bit about this process of reading a creative work and what it means to hear a creative work out loud. And I guess there is kind of this thought that it's almost like a cover version in some cases. I think that's kind of a good metaphor to start thinking of it as. But that almost presumes that the way we read something on the page is a lot like the way we hear something, which it's not. We understand them in very different ways. One of the things you'll notice you're doing when you're reading things on the page or if you're reading along is that you can pause like halfway through and look at a word and think about it, or you can sort of miss something and go back and reread it, or even start from the beginning or start in the middle, and there are all these nonverbal cues. For instance, on my talk sheet here, there are all these white spaces, which I know means a pause or breath, and I have punctuation, which is a symbol for all these understanding things. And when you're hearing something audibly, a bunch of those things don't exist, or they exist in a completely different format. And a lot of what we're trying to do is learn how to translate those into either non-verbal cues or tonal clues or things like that. So it's essentially trying to turn punctuation into voice and body somehow, and to make it more of a physical experience. So one thing that we're doing when we're learning how to read something out loud is both to communicate the message of the piece and sort of the intent around the piece and how you think it should be understood, which is what some of those readings were doing, as each way kind of shifts how we view the poem and what things seem to be emphasized. So I guess the act of reading then is less transliteration and more just translation. It's changing mediums. It's, again, like adapting a book into film, or I guess in some other terms, maybe a film into a musical or something like that. We're constantly shifting the line. I made one of these just for you.
Thanks.
It's got a kiss on the back in my photograph.
Sweet.
So the key is that we're trying to figure out ways for the audience to understand both the meaning of the piece and sort of the intentions around it. So we're always kind of in this strange love triangle between the reader and the piece and the audience.
Triangle.
So I guess, why is this important? There's obviously the sort of basic rhetorical talk of this, that being able to read something well makes your piece better understood, and therefore better received, and you get more ethos, and if you read at an open mic, someone might come up and hug you or buy you a drink, and that means free beer, which is always handy. But there are some deeper reasons than that. And one of them is that when you're actually forced to think about a piece and think about the intentions and the tonality and the various ways that those things are working, along with the pauses and how you translate things, it forces you to become intensely aware of a piece and to really understand it and to have a personal relationship with it. And that level of personal reflection and awareness of your own writing is what makes you a better writer. It's how you learn to be a better writer. So by learning to read a piece out loud, we are essentially learning how to be better writers and better critics of writing. Because you end up getting this strange education on like the nuances of your own voice, and you have to learn to listen to your own voice and figure out what a message is and how you communicate that. So, kind of going back to this metaphor, sometimes you're the evidence, sometimes you're the evidence and the expert, or sometimes you're the evidence and the lawyer. And you have to figure out how to plead your evidence's case. And sometimes your evidence wants you to plead a standard normal case, and sometimes it wants you to plead insanity. And that's what we're going to try and figure out how to do with this idea of intentionality. So I'm going to sit down for a little bit and let Mr. J.R. Walsh.
I like that you've included Mr. in my title.
That's true.
I always rejected that since the days when I was we, and they wanted to say, put master in front of your name. I don't know if any of you had that experience where like the sort of pulled out of the youth as being master, my name without the initials. But all the things that I just did now have a certain intentionality. I've moved things around. I'm trying to create a difference between this guy and this guy, right? I'm very interested in how I also negotiate this thing between me, the reader up here, and you all out there. I can do dramatic pauses. It looks like I'm thinking. Maybe I'm just stuck. You don't know, and I like that. It gives me power. So I've gained a little bit of confidence up here before you. I'm also going to give you the tools of the audience to take power, where I'm going to point out that I'm probably going to look down at the paper a lot, and you may notice that. Or I may say like a lot in my speech. This is just for your own meta-awareness. But a writer has intentions. A writer chooses words, rhythms, line breaks, words that look good, words that sound good, maybe words that create dissonance or chaos. And a reader has certain intentions too. Someone who gets up before others has the opportunity through their intentions to accentuate or undermine the supposed intentions of the writer. So everything becomes an interpretation. This is my interpretation of that. If reading aloud, the reader, therefore, puts on some sort of show. There's an awareness of audience, even if I was ignoring you. If I was doing this whole speech with my back to you, I'm aware that you're there. I'm not a fool. I know I can hear people breathing and people out in the hallway. I could be showing contempt for you if I did that. I'm not. I rather like that you're here. Thank you. Perhaps the reader feels compelled to read for a number of reasons. Peer pressure, feed the ego, maybe there's a book deal, a promotional tour, maybe it's the holiday season and someone has asked for an occasional poem, like on Veterans Day. Someone says, hey, can you read a Veterans Day poem, and then maybe you read a Veterans Day poem, or maybe you read a protest poem and really upset the dynamic of your family. Could happen, but you've made a certain, you've dealt with their intention, and then you've intended to do whatever the heck you wanted, right? Or if it's Valentine's Day and you tell a poem about Santa and the free love with the elves, that could happen to you. Don't let this happen to you. Whatever the reasoning for reading, the reader takes control of the piece with his or her first utterance. Or maybe I should back up. I moved things around up here. What about the reader's body language? What about it? I don't want to necessarily go into a whole Bill O'Reilly style exploration of body language. But my lack, or maybe I stare at somebody too long and I keep talking at them and then they start feeling really uncomfortable. Maybe I wink. All of these little things do affect the perception of the poem. They may just provide a distraction. One might be free with the hands. I will kind of, like, if this were an animated feature and I were free with the hands, like one of my hands could go flying off and sort of hit the wall and slide down the wall. And that would be a poetry reading you might not forget. But you would also have to be animated for that to work. There's no scientific measurement of these things, but I suspect, in my gut, that any affected gestures affects the audience in individual ways. You had asked that question about reading in an opposite way, and I think that the sort of 4 or 5 versions sounded really unique to each person, and there was that intention to do different in that case, you know. We could have done the same thing where everyone tries to mimic the person before them, and then they'd have to work just with memory. But that's also that it's all about their intention. What do they want from it? So it's the reader's job, in my humble opinion, when reading aloud, to represent a poem in some way that's specific to them, to interpret, to show intentionality. The most conservative expectation of an audience is that you are going to deliver on some intention. You have to act like you know what you're doing, right? Like if I'm up here, while it may be comforting to watch me sweat, you expect that I do have something here on a paper in front of me that I'm going to share, and you may then take that somewhere and either throw it away or use it. That's the exchange, right? So, to sort of extrapolate, how does this then directly relate to what is on the page as I ruffle it? Does this work in accordance or opposition to the line itself, a line of poetry? That first line, can you read the first line again?
At night the dead come down to the river to drink.
It ends there, and you said that you stopped at the end of lines and with punctuation and so forth, and that's how you attacked the poem?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. In formal poems, I would be willing to say that the reader may read through an end stop in favor of continuity. Sometimes that happens. In some of those lines, they sort of wrap around, you can see them. And the reader did, in fact, not stop at the end, but read around to the next line. But I wonder about this idea of using the line break. If you write a poem with very specific line breaks, and then you go forth and you read it, do you pause at that line break or do you read around it? If you didn't want a reader to interpret it with that line break, why would you, in fact, read around the line? So I'm questioning, is the line break simply a tool of creation? Like, to get the poem out, you wrote it this way, you saw it in little blocks of text when you were writing? Maybe you did. Or is it a guide specifically for someone else to read down the road aloud? Like, I will pause where there are line breaks. My assumption is, as a writer of poems, my assumption is that people have the right to ignore all the rules and do it as they see fit. You don't see hammers when you look at a house. Should you hear the form when you hear a poem? It all depends on the intention of the reader at that point. That's my opinion.
Can you take a question?
Yes, I can.
Okay. As someone who loves poetry but does not write it,
Okay.
I'm always interested in the poet's intent and what the poet would, how the poet would prefer to have the poem read. I think that's part of what I should consider as I read a poem. Out of A, respect for the poet, B, more important, respect for the poem. And so I'm wondering, you know, how do you make, I guess I'm a little bit uncomfortable with your comment that it's up to the reader has the rights. Sure, the reader has the right, but how do you give the poem that consideration? How do you do that?
Are you asking me as a writer, how do I let go?
The two of you are poets.
Right,
Can I just clarify something?
Sure.
When you say the reader, you mean the person who is presenting the poem out loud?
Yes.
Okay, not the person who's reading the poem on the page?
Yes, that's correct. As a writer, I'm actually really comfortable with the fact that if anybody read something that I wrote aloud, that would be a beautiful thing, even if they butcher it. Even if they butcher my initial intention as how I hear it in my head, it's like, wow, someone actually took the time. So I'm just thankful. I don't know if you feel that way.
There's certainly an act of graciousness, but I think the poem, again, it's kind of this weird collaboration a little bit, because the poem itself, I think, has instructions in it, a little bit of how to read it. And part of what we're going to talk about in just a minute is like how you figure that out or what some of those might be. But then you also have to figure out how you're going to, I guess, honor those intentions or like work against them, or how they kind of work through you. It's a lot like it's kind of like sheet music in that you have kind of a sketch that the poem gives you and some basic instructions, but there's a lot that you have to fill in just through your own person and through your own performance style.
From a reader's perspective, I love the option of reading something, the same thing, in different ways at different times. I like reinterpreting things. I like reinterpreting my own work, too. Your opinion is sort of like from that respect of, I want to get inside the head of the writer and honor their intention, yes?
Perhaps. I really appreciate Erik's metaphor about music. I am a pianist, and there is an artful way to interpret a piece that you're playing on the piano. There's an artful way, which is like a step before saying there's a correct way. Just a tiny hair of a step before saying correct. And I feel that way about reading a poem. There is an artful way to do it. And I'd like to get closer to understanding the parameters and the, I don't know, the constructs of that artful way. Especially if I'm trying to get my class to do it. Not all teachers, but that's my context of being here.
So, in the classroom, if someone were to come up and do a varied reading, like if someone were to do the opposites sort of game, where someone goes for a straight reading and then the next person goes for a different type of reading, are they both right? Or is one more right than the other?
When that foursome happened, I did feel like one was more right than the other three.
But I
did feel that way, but I don't know if that was,
Well, I do suspect, though, that your interpretation of which one was more right might be different than your interpretation of what was right, or your interpretation of what was the most closest to the author intention. Because we don't have the author here to explain and lead us through the poem. I think this would be a good way to transition into this idea of what type of voice do you read in? Yeah?
Yeah, seems like it. Great. So this brings up kind of an interesting point. So you talked about when you're interpreting something artistically on the piano. How do you decide how to interpret something?
The writer has given me clues.
Okay, or like in a piece of music. Oh, so like the music.
You mean like slow, like...
Crescendo mark.
These don't exist generally in poetry.
Well, yeah. They don't, there are some cases where they very visibly exist. You get some instances like line breaks. But I think they invisibly exist in a lot of cases, and part of that is figuring out how you read some of these invisible things. And I'm sure there's sort of those invisible things in sheet music as well. My 6th grade saxophone music experience is probably not prepared me too much for this metaphor. But we were trying to think about that a little bit, because part of what we're interested in is, like I said, that kind of weird love triangle between, say, reciter. Between reciter and poem, or really piece. Because a lot of this stands true for fiction, I think, or a dramatic monologue, or kind of any form of writing. And then with audience. And your job as the reciter is kind of as a Sherpa. That you kind of know, you have to kind of figure out where the poem or piece wants you to get, and then figure out how to get everyone else there. And of course, one of the things we've been saying about this theory is that a lot of this you have to figure out yourself, that it's an individual thing. There do seem to be some pretty common ones that we see, and some common intentions that we see. And I think certain pieces tend to fit more or less into those, and I want to talk about some of those a bit. So the first one I was thinking about is like a narrative style voice. And that I kind of think of as the novel voice, or I guess more specifically, the book on tape voice. There's this interesting idea of perception that's going to come up throughout here. That whoever's reciting things has this weird relationship with whom they're talking to. And in some cases, they're actually kind of interacting with you guys in the same way that JR and I are fielding questions and asking you guys questions and things like that. And there's some cases where that's only sort of happening, and there's some cases where it's not happening at all. And one of the really interesting things with narrative voice is it's almost trying to have you ignore the fact that there's somebody there reading it to you. In the same way when, say if you were listening to a book on tape, you don't want to remember all the time. It's like, there's an English actor who is telling me about Harry Potter right now. You just kind of want to let like the story happen over you. So I've been drawing pictures a lot on these to help myself understand them. So the reader almost isn't there, and anything which exists kind of exists within the actual language. And the audience is supposed to be kind of encompassed by that. So this style is usually marked by very low-key reading that's not, it's usually very even-paced, not very melodramatic whatsoever. Sort of forget that there's somebody reading it. The only time that changes is if there's something within this like fiction world box that says you can do something louder, like if there's dialogue involved, or probably an onomatopoeic or something like that, then you can involve that. But otherwise it generally stays kind of flat and even paced. And so we have, to help sort of express this, we do have an example. This is an excerpt from Oranges by Gary Soto. I'm going to try and read this in a narrative voice to read this idea. So, Oranges. The first time I walked with a girl, I was 12, cold and weighted down with 2 oranges in my jacket. December, frost cracking beneath my steps, my breath before me and gone. As I walked toward her house, the one whose porch light burned yellow, night and day, in any weather, a dog barked at me until she came out, pulling at her gloves, face bright with rouge. I smiled, touched her shoulder, and led her down the street, across a used car lot, and a line of newly planted trees, until we were breathing before a drugstore. So there, very even voice. I'm not, in the super melodramatic way, I read The Dead the first time through. None of that. Very even, just focusing on actually getting the language across in a clear and understandable manner. So that's one way. And then we start to get a little bit more perception on the reciter's part. In this, I kind of think of the conversational or experiential style is what I'm calling it. And here there's this weird thing going on. And this is kind of what you hear in like dramatic monologues or theater a bit, but especially dramatic monologues, where you get this idea that the reciter is talking to someone. They're talking to somebody, but it's not you. And you probably can't see who they are. So they're talking to a blank thing. But you kind of get this weird witnessing as the audience. So this is kind of like, you know, you're staring in somebody's bathroom window and seeing how they react to something, or maybe somewhere less creepy you're staring into. And the interesting thing here is it's almost, the idea is that you're watching somebody react without that kind of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle of being perceived. So it's supposed to seem like an honest reaction. That's sort of emotional, but a little more authentic and not quite as performative. So we'll take a look at another example. This is from Mike Dawkins' American Love Story. It's the first half of the poem. It should be the full section. So it's called The Girl. Hallelujah, she knows how to shoot pool. She sinks her 8-ball, drinks me under the table. I whimper for a date, a smooch, a slap. She hits the jukebox, that old song. I change taverns, but she's there. Pigtails that fill me with moon silt and planet jelly. Lips that just keep on being lips. Little belly I want to ski across. At home, she's on top of the fridge, dog-earing my favorite Azorian epic. She drives the bus I take, cleans my teeth, cuts my hair, cashes my paycheck, taunting me, going out tonight, Jerry? See you there, doll, I say, shaking with optimism. So there, one of the weird things that's kind of going on is it's almost like your experience, like as the reader or reciter, you're experiencing the poem or piece at the speed that it's happening. So it's like you're talking about this in the present tense and going through this in the present tense. So hence it's a little more evocative. Now the next step from that is what I'm calling the paternal narratorial. Here the reciter is kind of talking to no one in specific, or in the conversational. In like the narratorial, the reciter actually starts kind of talking to the audience. But there's a weird power level that's associated with the narratorial voice because there's a knowledge behind it. This is like the essay voice or the like the elegiac poem voice, where it's ranging from something that's between like limited omnipotence on the part of the reciter to kind of like wise old man. Someone who knows more than you and is kind of talking or trying to teach you something in a way to express it. And it tends to be a little more emotional, but this is a little bit more of a past tense kind of talking. Almost like you're reacting emotionally, but with that politeness of sort of social convention of somebody watching you. It's like being very angry at the bank, sort of thing. Mr. Walsh.
You want me to read this like I'm angry at the bank?
Yeah, sure, why not?
But you can't really be that angry at it. Everybody's kind of angry at it.
Yeah, that's true. Think about the Monopoly Bank. You can get way angry.
I'm pretty angry at the Monopoly Bank. Where do you see yourself 5 years from now? the eldest male member, or is male member a redundancy, of the committee asked me. Not here, I thought. A good thing I speak fluent fog. I craved that job like some unappeasable taunting woman. What did Byron's friend Hobhouse say after the wedding? I felt as if I'd buried a friend. Each day I had that job, I felt the slack leash at my throat and thought that was its other trick. Better to scorn the job than ask what I had ever seen in it, or think what pious muck I'd ladled over the committee. If they believed me, they deserved me. As luck would have it, the job lasted me almost, but not quite, 5 years.
So would you be willing to talk about why you chose to read that way?
There's something in the emotional distance. There's an attempt to grapple with an emotion, but not to become emotional, because emotions would get in the way of the logic behind this. And I think that's getting at what you're talking about when you say like the sort of wise old man thing. I think of my dad in this position when he's not yelling at me.
Right, sort of restrained emotion, it kind of sounds like. And sort of being aware of witnessing that restraint at the same time, which is kind of an odd thing. Now, if the kind of narratorial or parental voice is actually talking to the audience, but putting them on a different level, the circus barker is probably the closest voice I can think of to talking to someone on the same level. And I guess I think about this in terms of a poetry slam. Have folks been to poetry slams, or are folks aware of them? A bit. Who is unaware of what a poetry slam is? Raise your hands.
It's okay.
It's kind of like the Price is Right of poetry, where there's...
You're still bitter.
Yeah, I am a bit. That's one day when I find Jesse Sawyer, who beat me every time, I will slash his tires. But what it is essentially a poetry contest where folks come to like an open mic style setup, and they have to sign up before they can read. So you don't necessarily know if you're going to be able to read due to the time restraints. And then they hang out in the audience, and then people pick judges to kind of gauge them on whatever criteria they decide makes a good poem. Usually how entertaining it is, or how meaningful it is, or whatever. But those people are randomly chosen from the audience as well. And people come up and read a poem, and they get voted on, and eventually they get usually some very small prize at the end, like a T-shirt or a gift certificate for like $25 at a nail salon or something like that.
Sweet.
But the interesting thing with this is this kind of idea to me that you have the audience here, and then like next to the audience, the poets are sitting and the judges are sitting. So it's a little different than if you go to, for instance, one of the log cabins reading and conversations, where people are set off by a stage, and they like go and sit on the stage, or they come from backstage or something like that, and there's a very separation. There's a really big connection here between like poets and judge and audience. So one of the things that the circus barker tone does is it's talking almost directly to you. And this is like the almost rhetorical tone, the public speaking tone, where you're viewed as peers. The only difference is usually you're viewed as somewhat disinterested peers, and that we have to keep your attention somehow. So standard lecturing doesn't work, so you have to do something kind of flashy that will actually kind of grab attention. And a lot of this is where you start getting, I guess when I think about the poetry slam pose, it's almost like you're reading a poem though you really, really have to pee. Because there's a lot of like nervous, constrained energy, and people cross their legs sometimes, or kind of like hunch and hobble. It's almost like seeing somebody really excited read something. And it's usually loud and melodramatic, and it tends to actually interact with the audience, and there can be audience response back. So we're gonna, by we, I mean I am gonna try and do a good old-fashioned poetry slam reading of an excerpt from Patrick McKinnon's poem, Dear Spaceman. America. America is a company. My newspapers, my magazines. You can either remain silent, you have the right to remain silent, or you can protest outside the courthouse. You can rail and shout and burn a goddamn flag. Burn those 13 stripes red and white. They burn your back, your skin. They pummel the frozen night. Are your lakes full of mercury? Do your fish live, or do they only die? I hope you've eliminated malls on your planet, and factories, and suburbs, and airports, and free enterprise. I hope your topsoil won't be gone by 2025. In the rear view mirror, Idaho, here we come. Another family without a father heading toward the mountains, looking for America as the day continues growing darker and damper and colder. But the blossoms didn't hold, and the fruit never formed, and the new administrative wing was more important than a parking lot, a few scraggly old cherry trees. So now there are no more cherry trees, no more orchard, no Muzz Payne. So they're, again, very loud. This is a form that was originally found, like, you're reading in bars and things like that, so you have to yell over drunk people. But it's a way of dealing with something that's very bombastic or very interactive with the audience. That one, I guess. So with that form, we had kind of this back and forth between the audience and the reciter.
Particularly the lady who came and shut the door
Yeah, exactly.
while you were reading.
That would be okay. Booing me would have been appropriate in a slam format, or cheering, or throwing a bottle. Yeah.
I'd like to add that with some of these other voices, there's a possibility of having a text to refer to, but in slam, you're just relying on that oral presentation. You have one chance.
Yeah.
To absorb it.
Yeah, there's also sort of this interesting interaction with the slam in that, weirdly, I'm talking to you as an audience, but at the same time, you're on my side. You know, when I'm hollering about the fact that topsoil is actually being destroyed, I'm not really saying that you guys are destroying topsoil. I'm to you, but I'm really talking about somebody else who's not here. So it's very kind of bandwagonish in that regard. And like, those guys are bastards, kind of that the other forms, it seems like this is one of the best forms to deal with that, if that's what the piece is going for. And I guess the next step past this, so you have the audience and the reciter acting almost directly here, but there's a way sometimes in this when, as somebody who's reading a poem, you have a poem that asks you to read something in a very strange way, you decide, kind of working directly against this expectation of public speech and of lecture and things like that. And it's one of the things it does is that it sort of it doesn't actively interpret the poem as much, or the piece as much, and still kind of leaves it open so that there's other interpretation that happens around the other side. It's kind of this Andy Kaufman moment of surprise. There's something coming around, or like getting jackassed. So in this form, while the audience is kind of paying attention to the reciter is doing something weird that surprises the audience. And the understanding is that it makes them more active in the artistic process. And therefore they have a more personal relationship with the poem. The way that this works is if is if, like, as you're in the audience, you understand that the reader is consciously doing this. That, I guess it's funny to see somebody fake a seizure, it's less funny to see someone have a seizure. And some of the poems here are very kind of seizure-ish. Or they're in a style that does. Did you want to get this one?
Here it
You want this one? You know it's coming up. Done.
A completed portrait. If I told him, would he like it? Would Napoleon, if I told him, if Napoleon, would he like it? If Napoleon, if I told him, Napoleon, now, not now, exactly as kings, feeling full for it, exactitude as kings, so as to beseech you as full as for it, exactly, or as kings.
That's just an excerpt of a much longer piece. So you know the drill. Why'd you choose to read it that way?
The portion that goes now, not now, and now seems to respond to Stein's idea of every time you encounter a word, you're encountering it in a different way from the first encounter you had. The earlier part, if I told him, if Napoleon, would he like it? All of that is, I think, just